Let's get started. Thank you all for joining us and making the choice to be in this of the many fascinating and great concurrent sessions that are going on. My name is Diane Klein-Kempker. I am an alumna of this law school. I graduated in 1997, so just shortly before the Critical Race Studies program came together formally. But it was my tremendous pleasure and to my great benefit to study with both Professor Kim Crenshaw and Professor Cheryl Harris while I was here. I was also here when Prop 209 was passed, and so I came here under one admissions regime and graduated from a much wider law school, right, than the one that I had originally come to. And it was in the immediate aftermath of that, as I think has been discussed here already. That was part of the preconditions that helped the Critical Race Studies program come into being, of which we have many alumni and current enrollees. And of course, all of us in the Legal Academy have benefited from its existence in one way or another through its scholarship and teaching and in the colleagues that it has contributed to our profession. I have been a law professor for 25 years, and for most of that time, I have taught in ways that were intentionally informed by what I learned in critical race theory, even when I was teaching in more conventional doctrinal areas like property and wills and trusts, areas in which I do most of my teaching. None of that had very much to do until relatively recently in the scheme of things with my understanding of my Jewish identity, or my identity as a Jewish law professor, or anything that I thought about anti-Semitism in the United States, in the legal academy, in the legal profession, or anywhere else, right? Anti-Semitism was not part of my area of professional expertise, and I'm not sure that I would say that it is even now, although I certainly have thought about it much more. So starting in about 2020, with some interested colleagues, I became an organizer and co-convener of a conference about law and anti-Semitism, which was intended to be a relatively wide-ranging and politically inclusive event, which is to say that it included and also interdisciplinary. Not everyone who presented at that conference was a lawyer or a law professor or thought of their primary area of expertise as being legal as opposed to sociological or historical or Jewish studies folks, right, religious scholars and so forth. It was broad and interdisciplinary in what seemed to us to be a relatively underexplored niche in anti-discrimination law. That is what the relationship was between the legal construction of Jewish identity by law in the United States and elsewhere. It's an international conference, and we had lots of participants who came from other countries and who worked on legal materials and other materials deriving from other historical and geographic milieu. It was not a conference that I would have described or thought of as a critical race or critical legal theory conference, though plenty of us who presented there use those perspectives. The conference ran annually for a number of years. Professor Schraub was one of its hosts in the year that it took place at Lewis and Clark, his home law school, and it took place most recently here at UCLA, which was the last year in which a conference as ideologically broad as it was could occur. Right? That is, it basically split because of the polarization that we now see. It was only half a joke as the conference was unfolding that the conference organizers had people coming to us complaining that what they were hearing from the podium, from the bima, as it were, was hate speech on both sides, right? That is, we had people from the left saying what people from the right were saying was hate speech, prepared to walk out on this basis, and the reverse, the ADL got involved, and so forth, whatever. I think it's no longer possible to have a conference as broad as the one that I had envisioned, though I'm glad to have done it in the years that I did. It reflected people whose perspectives were as diverse as could maybe civilly be maintained up to that point. So that's the experience that I bring to this. Again, not really my primary area of scholarly expertise, though I've read a lot and written a little bit from a critical race theory perspective about topics including the one which is organizing our panel today, which is what critical race theory has to do with anti-Semitism and with the study of anti-Semitism, and what the study of anti-Semitism can learn or gain from critical race theory. In a setting like this one, I'm hoping not to spend much time rehearsing what I regard as baseless and pointless accusations that critical race theory is per se anti-Semitic or any such thing, though we might want to diagnose that a little bit if our participants want to address that. So that's enough about me. I want to let each of them introduce themselves a little bit, and then I have a series of questions, but I'm really hopeful that everybody who has questions and things to say will have a chance to air them, that we can put everybody in the room into conversation with each other in one way or another. Again, taking these questions that are in the description as a jumping off point, but not necessarily to restrict our conversation. So, Professor Schraub?
Thank you, Diane. And it is a incredible honor to be here. And I look at kind of the cast of characters on these panels, and it's just like these are like people who I've looked up to for a long time, who have read for a long time, who've influenced me from well before I ever started as a legal academic. And so I'm not going to say something really dramatic like critical race theory saved my life, but it did save me from becoming a libertarian, and that's not nothing. And I remember I mentioned this because I was a precocious high school student. I read a lot, and I was reading a lot of philosophy, and libertarianism never grabbed me, but I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. I didn't have some alternative that made any sense to me, and I just felt myself slowly gravitating in that direction, even though it didn't actually resonate with my own experience or what I wanted out of my own politics. And at some point, I kind of stumbled across Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanchik's Critical Race Theory and Introduction, and it blew me away. It was a really formative experience on so many levels. But one of which was that reading that book gave me a language to speak about instances of anti-Semitism that I had experienced that I just didn't have before, that were very inchoate. And I couldn't put them into words because they weren't the sort of thing like somebody flying a Nazi flag, passing a law that says I hate Jews, right? They were subtler than that. They took a different direction than that, and I just didn't have a way to talk about it until I read that book. And so in terms of the reason I mentioned this, that libertarian line is it made me realize that it takes a theory to beat a theory. Right? That it's as much as, again, I was never that attracted to libertarianism. I needed something I didn't just need to know why that wasn't right for me. I needed something else that was. And the same thing I think is true for anti-Semitism, right? It takes a theory to beat a theory. And so a lot of times, conversations about anti-Semitism, particularly sometimes in progressive spaces, focus primarily on what anti-Semitism is not, right? They vote, this is not anti-Semitism. This is abuse of anti-Semitism. This is weaponization of anti-Semitism, and so on and so forth. All of that is extremely important under any circumstance. It's especially important right now. But it can't be all that we are doing, right? And when that is kind of almost the exclusive locus, and maybe, at the very, very end, there's some kind of throwaway line about how, and this is distracting us from the real anti-Semitism, but there's no substantive engagement or approach that says, like, here's what anti-Semitism is. Here is an approach for fighting it. Here is where it manifests. Here is how we tackle it, right? If you don't have a theory that can beat a theory of anti-Semitism, that resonates with how the Jewish community, as it's currently constituted, understands its own experience, even a significant amount of discomfort or unease with how anti-Semitism discourse is progressing isn't going to go anywhere. Right now, most Jews do not support the current interventions that are being done by the Trump administration that are quote unquote against anti-Semitism. I don't even want to give them that much credit, right? They're very, very strongly opposed. The polling data is pretty compelling here, and it's pretty overwhelming. But again, it takes a theory to beat a theory. So it's not enough to say, here's why all of that is wrong or incomplete or being done in bad faith, as much as all of that might be true. There needs to be something else that is responsive to actual Jewish community experiences with anti-Semitism, that speaks to how Jews perceive their role and, the various forms of marginalization, isolation, and alienation that Jews continue to experience in contemporary America or around the world. As I've said, I think critical race theory has an incredibly robust array of tools to speak about that, precisely because it's looking in a much more nuanced and sophisticated way than just either you're flying a Nazi flag or there's no problem here, right? But it's kind of up to us, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation, to build that out, to build something, it feels weird to say a positive account of anti-Semitism, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at, right? That can provide a fighting alternative to the incredibly destructive and dangerous way that anti-Semitism is being leveraged by the current administration.
Say some stuff. Then I'll say some stuff.
So, hey everyone, my name is John Feingold. Appreciate Diane pulling this together. It's really nice to be in a conversation with David, who is someone who I, for a number of years, tried to sort of track down and never really was able to. In part because David's a pretty prolific writer and thinker, and what I've really long appreciated is the sort of sharpness of his analysis, because I think oftentimes there's a way in which we can sort of exist in the world of smoke and mirrors, particularly as academics, where we say stuff that sounds nice, but oftentimes it's not actually as sharp as we think it is. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I will say just maybe one, just trying to think whether I do my recruiting pitch now or at the end, but I will do it now and at the end. So I, over the past year plus, really because of the broad-scale weaponization of anti-Semitism, which I think, among other things, I think the weaponization of is a form of anti-Semitism, A. B, I think it...
Can you say more about that?
Not right now, but I will. But just to sort of, as to, like, place where we could go. B, I think it undermines our ability to have the conversations and enact the interventions we need in order to actually sort of mitigate it. But against that backdrop, I have found myself involved in organizing higher education workers who identify as Jewish, who have found themselves in this moment and who, sort of have a broad set of orientations to Jewish identity and sort of politics domestically and abroad, but are deeply anxious about the way in which the language of anti-Semitism and Jewish safety has been misused, deployed, weaponized, instrumentalized, whatever the term you want to use, in a bipartisan way to undermine the legitimacy of political opponents and to essentially take particular terms and ideas outside of the domain of legitimate academic discourse, which is something that we heard earlier. And so for anyone here who's interested in learning more or getting involved in any of that work, I hope you all do. I don't have a QR code ready to go up now in the other room that I did, but if you just search Concerned Jewish Faculty, I think the website is concernedjewishfaculty.org. Get in touch there, and we can continue those conversations. But I will leave it at that for now.
All right. So I'm going to jump in again with some of the bulleted questions that are in our event description, but without any sense that should restrict our discussion. I think certainly among the most important sort of obvious questions or points at which to begin, something which I know both of you have written on, is how should we think about Jews and whiteness?
So I'm going to answer a lot of the questions somewhat obliquely and often with stories. But so, and I don't quite know why, but over the past year and a half, more BU law students, so I'm a professor at Boston University in the law school, have come to me and just shared stories about not feeling like they quite fit in. Oftentimes they're, self-identify as liberal, Jewish, but have a particular relationship to Israel that doesn't really fit any of the particular buckets that people are in. And they're curious about critical race theory. It's something that I do. And they also are just trying to figure out how people who identify as Jewish in the United States would be racialized as white, phenotypically, if you were to see them on the street, where they fit into everything. And what I often find is that these students actually have pretty sophisticated sort of analytical, just conceptual understanding of this sort of liminal marginal status that Jews who would be racialized as white in the US have in the United States, where there's ways in which it's a community that sort of faces marginalization, concern sort of historically underattended to, can be diminished, but also, get that, white privilege is real, and have it. And I think that critical race theory is a place where, it offers a lot of sort of tools and frameworks to just offer the vocabulary sort of, and concepts to understand how different groups sort of contextually, contingently sort of fit into different societies and societal moments, which is just sort of a long way of saying, it seems like a pretty obvious that a sophisticated set of ideas about race and racialization would give us a way to understand how sort of all groups, whether sort of Jews or not, fit into a particular societal racial regime.
Yeah, this is something that I've thought about quite a bit. And one thing I'll note off the jump is in the program, you threw in the parentheses Ashkenazic Jewish, right? And when you just mentioned it, you didn't add that in. And it's an interesting thing because I think it goes to something about when we're talking about Jews, which Jews are we talking about, right? Because there are very interesting things to be said about the interrelation of whiteness and Jewishness for a Jew who looks like me, with my background, right? But there is also a very interesting set of things to be said about, for example, Mizrahi or Sephardic or Middle Eastern or Ethiopian Jews, for example, that bring these up in different ways. And that, I will say, in those contexts goes beyond just like, well, of course, they're not white, right? Because I think, I think they're not, but there actually is an interesting racialization discourse that occurs there where, because they are seen as Jewish, they are therefore seen as white, right? Jewishness makes them whiter than they otherwise would be, and kind of is perceived as pulling them out of communities or backgrounds that they're otherwise a part of. And I think that, again, this, as you said, more nuanced, more sophisticated way of understanding race and racialization that critical race theory provides can do a lot of work here, starting with the kind of the immediately important thing that we take groups, we look at groups seriously, right? That we're saying if we're going to be talking about Jews, we need to know things about Jews, and we need to know more than maybe just the sort of very immediate pat understandings that exists in society that might just say, oh, Jews are from, they're from Europe and they look like me and they have this background. And sometimes the way it's put is that they're white in every respect, except for the very important exception that white supremacists kind of want to kill them, right? And I think there's a lot more to it than that. I wrote a paper a couple years ago called White Jews: An Intersectional Approach that tried to kind of apply intersectionality theory to ask the question, what does whiteness do to Jewishness? And what does Jewishness do to whiteness? How do these identities change when they're placed in conjunction with one another, right? And so, for example, if we think about the way we talk about white privilege or white supremacy as a function of power, and then we put that into conversation with anti-Semitism and Jewish identity, where like this notion of Jewish hyperpower is accentuated, right? Those concepts have some interesting interaction effects, right? That you wouldn't necessarily see if you're not going to apply this intersectional approach. When I wrote that paper, incidentally, I presented it both at Jewish Studies conference workshops and critical race theory conference workshops. And this was right around the time where we were really starting to see something you pointed out about how like this idea or this worry is, is critical race theory anti-Semitic, or who's opposed to who? And it was a really interesting experience because I do this paper that's critical race theory is intersectionality. I go to the Jewish Studies workshop, and they generally like the paper, right? It was well received. It's not like they were fawning, but it was how you want a paper to be received. But then they would come up to me. It's like, yeah, this is a really interesting paper. I really liked it. Oh boy, they're not going to like you at the critical race theory if you present it as a critical race theory conference because you're just talking about Jews and anti-Semitism. They're going to hate that. And then I go over to the critical race theory workshop and I present the paper, and it gets this good response, and it's again the same sort of thing. Like, oh man, I bet this is really controversial in the Jewish Studies workshop because it's critical race theory. We know how turned out everybody was fine with it, right? But everybody thought that so there was this again mismatch of mistrust that was depriving us of these really powerful analytical tools that we could be using. And so leaving aside whether my paper was any good or not, right? There is a tool that is not being used that I think can do a lot of good, right? And part of that is, kind of breaking down this sort of ambient mistrust that assumes either that, critical race theory is out to get the Jews, right? Or that, if you're talking about anti-Semitism, you're probably looking to undermine critical race theory, right? And we need to kind of, I understand where those mistrusts are coming from, but I think that, they're doing a lot of damage, right? And it didn't actually reflect my experience when I was workshopping that paper.
Do you mind if I just
No,
say?
please.
But
Yeah.
I do think it's important when we're gesturing to where the mistrust comes from, is that from the perspective of critical race theorists, critical race theory sort of early phase, one of the biggest critiques was that it was anti-Semitic and anti-Asian, often as well, in part because there was an emphasis and concern about disparate impact. And you had scholars who presented as progressive or liberal and Jewish and deployed that identity in particular ways in order to launch, but I think it's could be described as pretty gross mischaracterizations, or at minimum just like very sloppy and negligent. And so I think for anyone who's trying to understand where we are now in sort of relationship between sort of accusations of anti-Semitism and critical race theory, it is worth just looking into the scholarship from the early 90s and folks like Jerome Culp who are sort of leaning into the space and trying to respond, and others to again accusations where it's hard to see how you get to the claim if you are taking fully seriously and with any level of generosity what is being done across sort of a broad set of scholarship that we would think of as sort of early sort of pieces of critical race theory.
Yeah, I mean, this is a broad, there's a lot of words in the world, right? There are a lot of articles, there's a lot of essays, and there's definitely a lot of them, particularly in this topic, that are, as you say, they're slipshod, they're sloppy, they're reading in bad faith, right? And I'm familiar with some of the articles you might be referring to, and I'll also say that along the same period, there was also a parallel concern amongst some Jewish academics who were trying to participate and bring in Jewish perspectives at some of these workshops. And they said, mine was I'd be invited, and mine was the only paper that doesn't get included because people say, oh, this is Jewish study. It doesn't count, right? This isn't a valid part of this conversation. You're no different than someone who's white and middle class, right? Or they say, I presented a paper about Jewish identity. The word Israel never came up. That was the first three questions, right? That's all anybody wanted to talk about when I was asking. So there are genuine points of I said there's genuine bases of mistrust. I will resist the idea that it's unidirectional. But even beyond that, right? maybe this is me reading with too much generosity, right? But at least some of these articles, right? When you think about, for example, the development of like LatCrit, for example, and part of what it's doing is talking about how the earliest forms of critical race theory, it's not trying to reject them outright, but saying like there are parts that if you only look at it in this way, it's not going to capture Latina experiences, right? And so I was very young when all of this happened. I was not part of this. And so I can look back with some rose-tinted glasses. But maybe if we want to look, say, we're trying to feel out in a very awkward way, like what it would look like to have Jew-crit, right? Or something kind of heap-crit, right? It's going to be an awkward thing, right? And it's going to include criticism of what's being missed. And there's a lot of, it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, as any conversation about anti-Semitism, racism, what have you, is going to be. But if, and this is a huge if people are not coming into it with the idea of like search and destroy, right? That is like this is just an adversary I'm trying to eliminate. I do think that these can bring up some some interesting developments in the same way that are not about undermining, but are about ultimately invigorating the field.
So let me just say a few things about it, because I wasn't so very young at the time, and we have a mini reunion of my college class here. There are actually 3 people from the same college class graduation year who are all here. Ariella and Chris Goodman, we're all Harvard class of '87. Sorry if I'm giving away who you are. You can all do the math.
Yes.
Ish. Oh, okay. But I let me put in what will be admittedly oversimplified terms what I think is in some ways being gestured at, perhaps in the desire
perhaps too obliquely.
Perhaps too obliquely, yes, because what we're talking about is whether the critical race theory and race-informed critique of meritocracy is anti-Semitic because it is a critique of the rules by which many white-passing Jewish people played the game and won, and don't want to be told, when you got into law school, that was all bullshit, right? When you succeeded in becoming a law firm partner or a judge or a lawyer or a doctor or a dentist or whatever it is, you were playing by an unfair set of rules, and that in some way undermines what you did, right? You're like one conversational step from hearing about, sweatshops on the Lower East Side, and before you know it, the Holocaust, right? When you suggest that the admissions policies of the most elite institutions and law firms and so forth went on being racist even after they made room for white passing Jews, something which seems to me to be a fact of American life. They went on being racist even when they made space for white passing Jews. And this, what I've written about in this area draws from some indigenous and decolonization scholarship, the concept of the move to innocence, right? The move to innocence that is designed to save both the past and the future, right? And have felt even in myself, right, that when I first read about the American history of slavery, I had a reaction which I only much, much later came to see as like one of these very obvious moves to innocence, which is, no one I'm related to was here at the time. Don't come crying to me, right? So yes, it's horrible. I agree with the whole critique, but no one I'm related to was here. They were all in Europe doing whatever, right? I'm not responsible for the things those white people in America did. And this is a big part of a certain kind of American Jewish identity, including mine, right? That is, as a 6-year-old white person, 3 generations of this institution, my maternal grandfather, the non-Jewish of my 4 grandparents, was the first chairman of UCLA's music department when it moved to this campus. So I'm like, UCLA, 100 years, both my parents, my sister, right, et cetera, right? This version of the American Jewish experience is one in which many people are deeply threatened by the idea that the rules by which their parents and grandparents played and won had something deeply wrong with them. They don't want to hear it. Right? This is not academic, this is not scholarship, but it's a reality, I think. Thoughts? Reactions?
Can we just clarify? We are all talking about Farber and Sherry's as the radical critique of anti-Semitic, right? Or is that what we're all talking about?
And its fellow
And
travelers.
Yeah, but yeah, so
yes.
that is certainly an
Yeah.
example of the sort of
The
scholar.
highest profile
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Yes,
Again, as I said, I come at this.
yes, you were you.
I was younger, right? So I read that article for the first time in an anthology about critical race theory, right? It was included in the book, right? And so it wasn't viewed as like, like this is, in a way that I don't think, a Chris Rufo essay is going to get included in one of these anthologies going forward. I'll be honest, I teach an anti-discrimination seminar. That's on my syllabus, right? It's not, it's part of the kind of meritocracy debate. We put that in there, right? And there's a lot that I think is troublesome about that article. But again, I think if we start to piece through, right, from we adopt this perspectivist politics. What does this look like from a Jewish perspective, right? What can that tell us? However we answer that, that's not going to be the whole story. I think where part of the problem comes in is the idea is like, oh, well, from a Jewish perspective, maybe it has XYZ implications. Therefore, this entire critique of meritocracy is bullshit and needs to be dispensed with. That's wrong, right? But I don't think it's necessarily wrong to say, if we look at it from a Jewish perspective, are we going to see something different than if we elided that distinction and just, for example, grouped in Jews with white folks generally, right? That I don't think is wrong, right? And so to the extent we're prompting that sort of conversation, right? And then to the extent we can, what's the problem here, right? And it's maybe even more salient now than I think it was then, is that we say once we prompt that conversation, it immediately gets shortchanged because what happens when you start that conversation is the Trump administration comes with guns onto campus. And there's nothing to be had there. There's no conversation we can be had. And to that extent, I think, as much as we intuitively might think that, the problem we see right now is sort of this glut of anti-Semitism discourse. We're talking, it's everywhere, it's doing too much, it's causing all this danger. In a lot of ways, what it's actually doing is suppressing very important conversation to have about anti-Semitism, because it's obviously impossible to take that perspective-based approach if immediately lurking in the background, and this is the thing I want to come back to, but immediately lurking in the background is threats of deportation and imprisonment and slashing college budgets and getting, extorted for massive settlements. It's just not possible, right? And so this conceptual conversation I would like to have and say oh, well, we're feeling our way towards something that maybe can reveal something positive ends up understandably obscured by the very grim material reality of what anti-Semitism as a concept is doing to academic conversations in the year 2025.
So I guess one response is, I don't know if I would enter these conversations by sort of positioning anything as the Jewish perspective. I think it's in part because one thing that this moment has really surfaced is that within any community, of course, certainly within the Jewish community, you have a whole set of perspectives about particular issues. Within American Jewish communities, just questions about Zionism, anti-Zionism have been debated at least since the 1940s, or at least Palestinian sort of refugees and sort of how sort of American Jews sort of are oriented to those conversations. But also what you've seen at least, and so Marjorie Feld is an example of someone who's surfaced this work more recently, at least since the late 1960s, early 1970s, the same, or at least many of the same sort of prominent organizations who sort of positioned themselves as the authority on American Jews, including the Anti-Defamation League, use the language of anti-Semitism in order to delegitimize civil rights movements, particularly civil rights movements that were sort of endeavoring to sort of realize equality for Black Americans in ways that have incredible parallel to now. Books called, for example, The New Anti-Semitism, published I think in 1972 or 1973, that was in ways, from reading it seeming to sort of intend to discredit criticism of Israel and the way in which Israel was already sort of integrated into an imperial project. And so part of, and so I guess that's a long way of sort of saying why I wouldn't necessarily just sort of position something as Jewish perspective. But I'm not saying that a Farber and Sherry article should not be part of a curriculum. I think there's lots of benefit to including these fights, these early fights, to see what are the moves that different scholars are making in order to position themselves in different ways. And so for me, bringing that into a CRT class or an anti-discrimination law class would be asking, how is race operating in these articles? Like, what is the move that different scholars are making in order to try to discredit? And are the claims being made, are they empirical? Are they normative? Are they internally consistent? Is it all sort of incoherent and contradictory? As a way to see how scholars fight. And how identity gets mobilized in different sorts of ways. And then I think a different way to sort of ask some of these questions isn't about asking about sort of Jews, or one might say, Asian Americans or other groups, but sort of how the different sort of societal dynamics or like racial dynamics in particular, communities or sort of in time and place, sort of incentivize sort of different ways of playing games. That are the games. And then, so I'm invoking now Vinay Harpalani, who I think is here in another panel, but he's written about, I think quite importantly over the past couple years, is how sort of the way in which right-wing groups going after affirmative action have mobilized narratives about Asian American identity in clearly nefarious ways, not to promote civil rights for anyone, but to sort of undermine the ability to play race-conscious remedies. That has led to many on the left to reflexively sort of diminish the real racial harms or racial burdens that Asian Americans often are experiencing and facing, and the sort of the marginalization, socially or otherwise, that different Asian American groups have. And so I think it's important to sort of, as you're saying, I think sort of not to just do the, this is weaponization, this is sort of bad faith use of a particular argument or claim, in part because just staying there, can sort of reinforce some of the sort of the real social marginalization that certain groups are always experiencing. And I think is part of the goal. It's like part of the weaponization is the cracking that comes from the sort of reaction to just denounce the weaponization, as opposed to recognize that, whether it's, diminishing that anti-Semitism is real or that Asian Americans face discrimination. But the last little thing that I'll say, because I'm going in too many circles now, is that many of the folks who are on the front lines that are fighting the weaponization of anti-Semitism, they are also taking anti-Semitism very seriously. And just to make this very, very concrete, colleagues of mine at BU are hosting a webinar on November 13th with the host and the three panelists are all Jewish. Scholars of Arabic literature, anti-Semitism, religious studies. The title of the event is Anti-Semitism. What is it? Something else? How do we deal with it? On Wednesday, we got hit by 2,000 emails describing it as anti-Semitic, calling on the university to shut it down, saying that the ADL and Hillel have to vet all the materials beforehand. Carbon copies, emails, and it's, and so there is just such a pervasive bad faith that makes it impossible for scholars of anti-Semitism to be having conversations about anti-Semitism. And one reason why I know it's bad faith is because the emails were demanding security. You have to get security. It's a webinar.
Cybersecurity.
Because they want to make it too expensive.
One thing that that I think this raises, and it's something that I think is another area where critical race theory can get a lot of help. You talk about like perspectives, plural, right? And so a lot of like the particularly at the very in the early '80s when critical race theory was sort of getting off the ground, and you had these articles talking about like the voice of color, and then that eventually got several push about is this essentializing, right? And that led to I think some very fruitful conversations about, on the one hand, right, if we kind of assert this like univocal, like this group has this set of, this is the authentic set of opinions, it ends up enforcing an orthodoxy and a very exclusionary one at that. But you can very easily swing like pretty far in the other direction to like, well, everybody's different, and then we're back to libertarianism again, right? And so, and I think that's just a hard question, right? I don't think this is something that that has necessarily been solved. But I think there is, as you say, a very important Jewish angle to this question too, which is, on the one hand, recognizing, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? Recognizing the plurality of Jewish opinions, right, on any important subject, whether it's politics, Zionism, whatever you want, while avoiding, I think, the possibility of, to quote Justice Scalia of all people, looking over the crowd and picking out your friends, right? Where the manner in which, and I'm particularly talking about non-Jews here, conduct their engagement with the Jewish community is by finding the Jews who already agree with them, and then just agreeing with each other, and then saying like, oh, therefore, and now I've done done this work of cross community engagement, which I don't think satisfies that principle. So on the one hand, I don't want that to be how it works. On the other hand, I don't want it to be the situation where where the ADL just gets this like blanket veto to tell everybody what the Jews think, right? So what do we do about that?
So there's something I want to say about that, and we will transition to even more difficult. Well, maybe it's also the same subject. I mean, what I'm reminded of by the remarks that you were making are both a genre, literature would be to overstate it, but a genre of writing, and then the critique as a Jew, right? It's every article that begins as a Jew, right? And then this non-appointed, non-elected, self-styled person describes their own experience, right? And it's not, I mean, they are speaking as a Jew, right? It's not, I'm not here to say they're not entitled to understand their experience through that lens. And I know this is something that you're working on, this epistemic side of things, which I think is one dimension of weaponization. And so I want us to talk a little bit more about weaponization, and I want us at least to talk a little bit about whether you think we are, I think we are in this moment, so you may disagree that we're in this moment or agree we're in this moment, and then speculate about the origins of how it is we are in a moment in which anti-Semitism and the allegation of anti-Semitism is being used for one purpose more than any other purpose, and that is to suppress anti-Zionist speech and speech promoting Palestinian rights. That's the label to which anti-Semitism is, it seems to me, most destructively being applied. It's not the only thing to which it's being applied, but it is among the things to which it is most destructively being applied, both politically and intellectually, because of the conversations that it shuts down.
So I'll be brief, and I'll try to be more brief, so in part because I would love for this to become more of a conversation.
Yeah.
So I think CRT is helpful here with the concept of interest convergence. What we're experiencing now is not a Trump thing, and this was very bipartisan. If we're sort of thinking about the post-October 7th moment. But so Diane, your point about how the way in which, in this email that got spammed to BU administrators, sentence after sentence is claiming in a like Cuomo sort of way, if you heard him say anything recently, like, talking about sort of truths or facts, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Over and over and over in this email, and then anti-Zionism is the newest like way to veil anti-Semitism. It's all of that, and I think like the interest convergence is that after October 7th, you get this groundswell of student anger that is directed not just at Israel, but at their own institutions, complicity in what they see as just very, obvious human rights violations. And there's Sahar, her center put out a really helpful report called Presumptively Anti-Semitic that, then was cited as anti-Semitic by a House committee. But that does a nice job just identifying the sort of the patchwork of organizations that have long dedicated themselves to preventing university campuses from being spaces in which you could have meaningful conversations that are critical of Israel or are critical of Zionism. And so that was a moment in which organizations, and it's not just the ADL, but they are there, they benefit from a narrative that depicts students who are, almost entirely peaceful as either terrorist sympathizers or themselves terrorists. And this is who really likes that? Chris Rufo. Because Chris Rufo has spent the past 3 years sort of figuring out how to just infuse public discourse with a narrative that turns anti-racism toxic by rendering itself racist. And if I think it was October 13th, Chris Rufo says on Twitter, what we need to do is brand BLM, Democratic Socialists of America, and someone else as pro-Hamas sympathizers. And he is using precisely the same template and playbook that he just ran across the country. And it's this moment in which you have groups whose interests are a little bit narrower to, policing pro-Palestinian advocacy, to maintaining sort of a certain sort of reputation for the state of Israel, with a Christian fascist movement.
Yeah.
But then, interest convergence, if you ever paid attention, that doesn't last forever. And there were a lot of Jewish academics who are like, ADL, you better watch out. We saw this in Charlottesville when you were a little bit too cozy with the Christian nationalists. And then what happens? ADL gets smacked down by Elon Musk for having reported on Christian nationalism, including folks like Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA. And so one of the stories that we have here is and this is, probably the folks talking about TWAIL stuff right now are much better positioned to sort of explain how sort of international sort of policy and empire sort of and Israel's relationship to the United States sort of is part of this. But there's a way in which there was bipartisan interest convergence, we're still seeing it, that has sort of led the door to, and David, I'd actually really like your perspective on this, on how it is that the most unapologetically anti-Semitic presidential administration, at least, I don't know, since
in 100 years.
In 100 years, gets to continue to just, preach to everyone about anti-Semitism, and no one is calling,
Explain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's grotesque is the immediate answer. One answer that I would give to this, right, is that so the discourse about anti-Semitism right now that is being promulgated by the Trump administration is very much predominantly not Jewish driven, right? Obviously most Jews did not vote for Trump, don't vote Republican. Project Esther, which is their template from the Heritage Foundation, was mostly written by non-Jews, right? As I mentioned, the program's polling data suggests widespread Jewish opposition, right? The overwhelming Jewish opposition to them, right? So we can reframe this question, right, as why aren't Jews able to control discourse about anti-Semitism, right? Why is this completely spiraled out of our hands, right? And even groups like the ADL, which have very much not, as you say, been covering themselves in glory in the present moment. As you're saying, they're not the ones controlling it either, right? Because when they try to kind of step out of line, as you said, they get slapped down immediately, and the FBI is terminating all their kind of consulting contracts and viewing them as part of the same Soros-funded conspiracy as all the rest of us, right? So we can then ask, well, what would anti-Semitism discourse look like if Jews played more of an influence over it, right? And there was a really it was a poll that I read. It was from around 2020, so it's pre-October 7th. But I think it was really illuminating. I think it still illuminates, and it just fascinated me where they asked, it was Jewish respondents. They gave them a list of very kind of sharp criticisms of Israel, and asked them like, do you agree or disagree with this? But then also, if you disagree, is it anti-Semitic or is it not, right? And overwhelmingly, the answer to these questions was disagree but not anti-Semitic, right? That was a consensus answer. Is Israel an apartheid state? Don't agree with it, don't think it's anti-Semitic. Is Israel committing genocide? Don't agree with it, don't think it's anti-Semitic, right? Is Israel, acting akin to Jim Crow? Don't agree with it, don't think it's anti-Semitic. The one outlier, right, the one that was viewed as overwhelmingly anti-Semitic was Israel has no right to exist, right? That one was viewed as anti-Semitic. And I read that and I was fascinated by it because if I look out into like the public space of discourse, right, and think about the order, I can't name who runs that line, right? Which organization takes the view that it's not anti-Semitic to genocide, apartheid, Jim Crow, none of that's anti-Semitic, but right to exist, or denying right to exist is, right? If you're the ADL, you think they're all anti-Semitic, right? If you're Jewish Voice for Peace, you think none of them are anti-Semitic, you agree with all of them. Who's the one that, who are the people who's speaking out for this position, which again appeared to be an overwhelming consent, it was very, very, very stark divide, right? Where is this perspective, right? It just seems to be entirely absent, right? And so if we take from that, right, when I hear how people talk about right to exist, right, that line, it's often presented as sort of this like trick question or a trap, that it's a back door into license, demanding that we accept all sorts of Israeli human rights violations. And this polling data suggests that's probably not true, right? Because there's a ton of people who are fine with, at least don't view as anti-Semitic, these really, really harsh critiques, but see this as different, right? And so if we took that, we took that seriously, right? On the one, it might, I've referred to this as the grand bargain, where right to exist is the sort of the no-go and everything else is on the table, right? That would require, on the one hand, that would very much challenge what the ADL wants to put forward, which is, again, that all of this is anti-Semitic, right? It would also mean some changes in certain, certain pro-Palestinian advocacy that says, that might have to think about, well, is there a problem here? The million-dollar question I think that we actually need to ask is, everybody in this room is committed to the notion that in an academic space, we can raise an ism claim. We can call things, for example, racist, without it being just inherently a form of censorship or silencing or chilling. That race card line is something that has very long been deployed against critical race theory, and it's a way of making discourse about racism impossible. The million-dollar question is how it would be anti-Semitism is one of the most powerful mobilizing tools the world has ever seen. It would just be weird if it just skipped over, had nothing to do with Israel, right? That it just didn't come into play at all, right? That's not the same thing as saying anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic. It's saying that there are important arguments that need to be had, one of which is debates about what is and is not anti-Semitic. The million-dollar question is, how can we have that conversation in a productive way without it being, without it triggering or being exploited in these manners that are unabashedly repressive and authoritarian, right? Because the answer can't be that anytime the ADL says boo, someone goes to jail. But the answer also can't be, right, if you're calling something anti-Semitic and I disagree with it, right, you're MAGA, right? That there has to be room, and as a scholar of anti-Semitism, this is something that I run into a lot, where I feel this pressure quite acutely. If I call something anti-Semitic and someone else disagrees with it, it's not generally viewed as we're academics and we're having a disagreement, which happens all the time. It's viewed as like I am part of a project, a dangerous project of censorship. And there's just not much there's nothing I can say that really will disabuse people of that notion, right? Because of the way again, this goes back to the anti-Semitism discourse isn't in my control, right? It isn't in my control. It isn't the Jewish community's control. It is being seized from us and is being colonized by these kind of repressive right-wing forces that are overwhelmingly not Jewish.
So I think that account understates quite a bit the role that the ADL has played because one of the reasons why I think Trump has been able to continue with this narrative is because you had an organization that generally in the public sphere is seen as speaking on behalf of Jews, and said repeatedly, and its president said repeatedly in quite horrific language at times, that what we're seeing on campuses, these encampments, this is not just anti-Semitism, this is Jew hatred. That sort of language and that sort of rhetoric. And so I don't disagree that it's now just out there and out of control, but I think...
The lepers ate their face, right?
Well, 100%, but
Yeah.
there was a way in which, there was an identity politics there, where you had the face that was able to legitimize the claim, and then it's out of control. And in terms of... Yeah, so actually, I'll pause, because I want to...
There's something I want to say, and then I want to give people a chance to talk, ask questions, or say things, or whatever. There's one thing I want to say about right to exist, right? Does Israel have a right to exist? Which is now a narrative framing that I endeavor to resist, including in talking with Israelis about it. The way that I talk about it, including the way that I talk about the United States, is that Israel needs regime change, right? Like we need regime change, right? It's not right to exist, right? That, when people say no one talks about whether other countries have a right to exist, right? Because that's not the framing by which we talk about human rights abuses in China or human rights abuses in North Korea, right? What we say is they need regime change, right? That what we wish is that they had democracy, equality, protection for the rights of minority, however it is we might talk about it. It seems to me we talk about it much more in a regime change framework than we do in a right to exist. Right? What does it mean to say a state has a right to exist or doesn't have a right to exist, right? It seems to me it's a particular kind of rhetorical distraction, actually, that's also meant to conjure up genocidal fears, right? That is that saying a country doesn't have a right to exist is like saying its people don't have a right to exist, which is like saying it's okay to kill them all, when I don't think it, I think it is designed to trigger that emotionally, when I think, again, there's obviously more to say about it, right, as there are about all of these things. But go ahead if there's something you want to say.
I think the fact, as you said, the fact that we have this other language, I'm not sure if regime change is what I'd use, because it reminds me of the Bush administration, honestly, and that an invading.
So we're supposed to bring it about,
right.
But yeah.
But the idea that we have a well-established rhetoric of saying that a government's various policies and practices need systematic alteration. That is very well established. Underscores to me that this whole right it's not necessary, right? And that you're not losing anything if someone says does Israel have a right to exist, and you say yes, and then just immediately move on to and there needs to be systematic change, that nothing's being lost. And what I was getting at with that polling data is, again, the fear is that when you make that concession, it immediately is going to get leveraged to mean, well, if you're making these sharp criticisms of Israel about saying that it, what it's doing in the West Bank is apartheid, you're denying its right to exist, and that it's this backdoor way of smuggling all that in. That's the fear, right? And that's, I think, why a lot of people are resistant to making that concession, because they think it's sort of like give an inch, you'll take a mile, right? And again, what I'm saying is that polling data suggests that's not actually what's going on. Right? And it really is a genuine, however well-founded fear it is or isn't, a genuine fear about, is the question obliteration of, of the Israeli national grouping as a national category outright, right? And then when people are play kind of cagey about that, that then generates, I think, a significant anxiety, right? That stands wholly apart from a lot of people who are willing to say, like, yeah, we should have the conversation about, is there apartheid? Is there Jim Crow? How do we make, these policy reforms?
One, I'll say two things about that, and then I really will stop, give people a chance to talk. One is, right, then you open the door to talking about Jewish ethno-nationalism and exceptionalism, right? Is there just one place in the world that gets to have religious ethno-nationalism, and that place is Israel, in order to have the right view on this issue, right? Or not, right? I mean, I think that is one way of thinking about it. Oh, okay, say
No. We could do this all. We could do this.
But just to sort of abstract out a bit, one thing that is has been, and so Sahar came on the podcast that I do in November of 2023, I think it was, and the conversation was, not getting it quite right, but why it's impossible to talk about Israel-Palestine. And part of the reason why it's impossible is because we have really powerful organizations that want to make it impossible. And so for the conversations that we were having about encampments, we were not talking about why students were protesting. We were litigating whether what was happening was anti-Semitism. And that's an incredible coup if what you want to do is to prevent having hard conversations about the ways in which institutions that we really care about are engaged in different sorts of ways in practices that are troubling. Which is not to say that we can't also and shouldn't also have a conversation about how what's happening on campuses and affecting different campus constituents in different ways. But we didn't have, there was no national discourse that was asking, why are they there? Folks like Mahmoud Khalil were being asked, people say this is anti-Semitic. What is your response? And so I think, whether it's Israel's right to exist, whether it's apartheid, whether it's genocide, one reason why it's hard is not just because these are delicate questions where people come with different histories, where the student who was in my office the other day is sharing with me how their mom genuinely thinks that Israel is critical to her safety as an American citizen so that she has a place to flee if something goes down. And it's important to understand that. It's important to understand what people feel, what is their fear, in part because that's what people manipulate. And because and there has to be an opportunity to just be gracious with people who are scared. But also to not let fear and some subjective sort of understanding of a particular set of events then dictate, what is okay and what is not okay. And so, whether something is subjectively troubling, objectively problematic, there's always going to be hard questions that are always going to be contested. But there is, a very well-funded agenda to make it impossible for us to understand where we're coming from, to have sort of exacting conversations, and to, ask, does Israel have a right to exist? Does the United States have a right to exist? I don't think so. I don't think so.
Well, and an academic space has to be one in which people can have differing views and can be wrong and not be criminals.
No, exactly, not be criminals, right? And so we should, we absolutely have to be able to ask, does Israel have a right to exist? Does America have the right to exist? But we also have to say no.
Right,
but we also have to be allowed to ask, is a position on that question anti-Semitic or Islamophobic or racist? Right? That there can't
yes or no.
Say yes or no. Right?
And then have curriculum where we're not just tossing out terms like racism or anti-Semitism, but we're being precise. We're what do we mean? Because we do not mean the same thing. When we're using these terms right now, we mean different things. And so, how can we just be more precise? Do we mean that that there's resentment that a particular group faces? Do we mean that there's,
Yeah. All right, we'll start. Go ahead. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alana. I'm really glad that this conversation is happening here. Just to bring it back more specifically to CRT, I have two questions. One is inspired from Professor Russell Robinson's presentation earlier about the inversion of intersectionality. I'm a UCLA grad student. That's something we're seeing here in a lot of the cases related to anti-Semitism, is this inversion of intersectionality. Jewish students kind of weaponizing a lot of the DEI or CRT theorizations onto their own claims on marginalization. So I'd love to hear you speak about that a bit. And then secondly, I'm thinking about the 1975 Zionism as racism claim in front of the UN General Assembly. And that was 50 years ago. There's been a lot of events coming out right now about what does it mean 50 years after Zionism as racism. And I was noticing, I'm going to the American Studies Association conference, they're doing a panel about it, and I'm seeing that kind of this critical Zionism studies is propping up more and more the past couple of years. And that made me think about the relation between CRT as like a field building endeavor, and what kind of field building could we be doing right now, whether that's critical Zionism studies, critical Jewish studies, etc. That would better merge some of the work coming out of, coming out of critical race theory that we could apply to questions about Judaism or Zionism or Israel.
So I'll just take on the last question just very briefly. I think in terms of understanding how racism operates in the United States, it's really like sort of centering Blackness in a particular analytical way, and anti-Blackness I think is really important. But I think CRT, like any sort of discipline or intellectual space, is not sort of limited to that. And so part of the question now is how we can be building containers and spaces for different people who want to enter the work from different ways and focus on different things to occupy space and build and grow. And so I think the answer is, how do we do that? How do we create that infrastructure?
I was planning to take the first one. So,
Look at that.
because there was and I think you're probably familiar with what I'm talking about here. There was a period where it seemed like if you read Tablet Magazine, Jewish Daily Forward, any of those outlets, there would be like 9 articles that were all like critical race theory, it's anti-Semitic, 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 and then the 10th article would be like, why isn't there a critical race theory for the Jews, right? And it will not surprise you that I think that 10th article is correct, and the first 9 and the preceding 9 are not, right? But of course, one, like part of the reason why the 10th one is asking that question is because of this hostility, this mistrust that we talked about before. But I think that one thing that comes up when we think about how if we are trying to build out an organic kind of Jewish critical race theory, or Hebrew crit as it's sometimes called, right? That we can't enter the project with a demand about what has to be the conclusion at the end of the project, right? And so for any political orientation, liberal, conservative, Zionist, anti-Zionist, it is very possible that the insights that will come out, because I think this is still very nascent, that will come out of that will sometimes challenge certain shibboleths, right? That it will, I think there's a very good chance it will challenge certain Zionist shibboleths. I think there's a very good chance it will challenge certain anti-Zionist shibboleths. And if the goal of these sorts of orientations is how can we, use the Jewish experience to validate the things that we already believe about Jews, or already want to be true about Jews and Jewish institutions, I think that is going to be a malformed project, right? And so I think it has to leave open this space that if we're encountering we're encountering this group in its otherness and its and its difference in a way that hasn't maybe been done in the same systematic way that we might like, that there might be things that we are missing, or things that we don't know, or things that will make us think differently than how we thought before, and being open to that possibility, I think, is a prerequisite to this being a successful project.
There was a question here, and then Scott.
Could you say a little bit more about the article that you alluded to, that you say was included in the CRT book?
Sharon Farber.
Yeah,
That's the one. That's the one.
Is the radical critique of merit anti-Semitic? That one?
Say again slower.
It is the radical critique of merit anti-Semitic. It was written by Daniel Farber and Susanna Sherry in around like 95 or so, and then generated a very large response.
What did it say?
Yes, the
Yes.
answer to the question
Right.
was yes.
Yeah, so the answer to the question was yes. The idea was that what they call, again, they're referring to what they say is the radical critique of merit, that merit is entirely a social construct, that it only exists as a function of power, right? Can't explain how a group like Jews could over-succeed within a merit paradigm without relying on anti-Semitic beliefs about Jews. For example, the ones they list off are like Jews as parasitical on the majority culture, or Jews as secretly dominating the majority culture, right? And so they're making a defense of maybe a more traditional capital L liberal conception of merit and meritocracy that says that our problems are about biased application of standards, but it's not that merit is an empty concept. It's that we apply merit in biased ways that work to the disadvantage of various marginalized groups.
Thank you.
Sahar on the hair.
So I wanted to think about this in three different groups if we're looking at the diverse Jewish American community, which I know is contradictory to say just three groups. But if I think of just like liberal Jews, especially within what we'll call the intelligentsia writ large, not just scholars or academics, but just educated groups, the establishment Jewish organizations, and then a small but growing number of conservative Jewish Americans, as in Republican, right? But really, I'm struggling to understand how context and relative power isn't considered deeply enough in a lot of the discussion about anti-Semitism, let's say by the good faith actors. So let's say with the liberal Jewish people, individuals, not the establishment, because I think that is very different. You all touched on this. It seems as if the conversation is always trapped in the Christian world. The Christians and the Jews, the Jewish question, the European anti-Semitism is imported into the United States, and we're seeing it on full display, with turning point in the white nationalists. And that's real, right? And then we can talk about, is it as bad, is it less, is it this, is anti-Semitism a light sleeper, etc. And then there is the Orientalism and the Islamophobia that is also Western, and that when you are socially constructed in whiteness, which my position is Jews are. So unless you are not a non-white passing Jew, your race has been socially constructed as white, right? I think that is a factual reality. And in 2025, I'm not saying in 1915. And so then with the racial hierarchies, what we're seeing is in the US context, the Palestinians, the Arabs, the Muslims have significantly less relative power. And if you are going to think of racial hierarchies, Palestinians are within collective blackness, and Jews are within collective whiteness in the US context. And I think that theory, right, this description has completely been validated by the last 2 years, but particularly from October 2023 to January 2025, because I don't want us to get distracted with January 2025 to September or October 2025, right? And so I am just really baffled at the level of apologistic gymnastics that has occurred within many of the so-called kind of liberal Jewish American intelligentsia, and not recognizing that the Palestinians, the Arabs, and the Muslim students, faculty, families have been treated in ways that really mirror the racism against Jews in the early 20th century. And then the travesty is that it's the Jewish establishment, these organizations, that are leading that. And I think that's where it gets really difficult to take anti-Semitism seriously. And I agree, it's hard to even have the conversation. Because if you go and do an empirical study and you ask, okay, how many faculty have had death threats? How many of them have had to spend thousands of dollars to increase security on their houses? How many of them had to file multiple police reports, have had to file hate crime, bias reports with the FBI? How many students have been expelled? How many have been disciplined? How many have had their degrees denied? How many of them have had their organizations dissolved? And we actually look at the empirical data that proves discrimination and racism. I'm willing to bet that the number of Jews that are socially race as white and the number of Arabs, Palestinians, and Muslims that are race as non-white, I think that it's a huge disparity, right? And meanwhile, you have congressional hearings on anti-Semitism, congressional resolutions on anti-Semitism, task forces on anti-Semitism, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, IRA definition of anti-Semitism being codified. And so that is somebody needs to talk about that within the Jewish community, because from the vantage point and the positionality of Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians, the Jewish establishment is acting like white nationalists. They're acting like turning point for our community. And this is not a feeling. We have evidence, right? And so that is where it's really starting, and I'm talking about the liberal Jewish communities, and nobody seems to want to acknowledge that, yeah, my community is really hurting another community, really hurting them, oppressing them, like violating their civil rights, or at least in their name. And with the exception of the anti-Zionist Jews, who I think have really very boldly, very courageously been on the front line saying, no, not in my name. We are not going there. This is a complete contradiction to everything, to combating anti-Semitism, much less any other values, is people have just been watching and going, wow, yeah, this is not, this doesn't make any sense, right? So that is not to say that the traditional anti-Semitism isn't real, but where is that conversation? And is it happening not in the anti-Zionist Jewish space, because I have heard it and I'm part of it and I'm engaged with those people, but where is it happening in the mainstream majority space? And is it possible for Jewish Americans to have that conversation and say, our community is hurting another minority community. We are victimizing other people while we fear being victimized, and kind of coming to terms with that, right? And I'm not to say, that doesn't mean that Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians can't victimize other communities. But there is this theme of like being immune from being an oppressor. And no one is immune from being an oppressor. And so I just would like you guys to talk a little bit more about that, because positionality and context and relative power matters a lot. And it's not all about white Christians vis-a-vis white Jews, right? There's everything the last 2 years, that's not been the relative context. It's been the Palestinian Arab Muslims and the Jews, and that's who's being positioned. And I'll just finally say that the Jewish establishment, AJC, ADL, a bunch of others that are in the middle, really need to decide whether they are there to protect Israel from criticism or whether they are there to protect the civil rights of American Jews. Because I don't think that they're doing the latter at all, and I think they know that.
So I have some thoughts, but
Go ahead.
okay. And this connects to conversations that we've had before. I think it's absolutely correct to say that the ambient Islamophobia of American life that has characterized it at least since 9/11, I would say that would be the turning point date, not an origin moment exactly, but certainly a turning point date, has received nothing approaching the appropriate level of attention from the organized, or as the case may be, disorganized American Jewish community. I think that is absolutely fair to say. And I think that continues a historical pattern in which it has been largely the concern of white passing, Ashkenazic, European descended Jews to look upwards at the institutions and organizations from which they have been excluded, and not outwards and downwards at their relative position vis-a-vis other minoritized and racialized groups in America. And I think what you're pointing to is that that has not changed despite the acuteness of the moment, right? And so it's not, I would say, and maybe even this is too much of apologetics, that it's not, I think, so much that the Jewish community has itself been, maybe until very recently, leading the charge or the practice of Islamophobia in America, so much as not attending to the way in which it's been carried out by a dominantly white nation, has not stood in the way of it, has not seen it as something with which Jews should be making common cause. I think that's fair. I think that, which is again, not to say, I mean, I think we're now in this moment of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, I think that I think it's a fairer and more recent criticism. I'm not sure I think it's as fair a criticism earlier, because I'm not sure I think of Jews as having had access to the levers of power in that way, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well,
Maybe
let
I'm
me
wrong.
just respond.
Yeah.
I think Jewish Americans, at least what I observed, and this is an empirical question, so I might be wrong. My impression was like with the Muslim ban, the Jewish Americans showed up, right? And I think with traditional civil rights, especially if you go back in time, they did show up, right? In relative numbers. My point is that once Palestine comes up,
It's different.
suddenly
It's different.
you're like, whoa, it's stark and it's shocking, which makes it even a more painful betrayal. Because you think, if you are truly, let me flip the script. If there is a Muslim organization that is highly sensitized to Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism and is committed to it, and then suddenly starts engaging in ways that tangibly harm Jewish people in ways you can, like I listed, that's unacceptable. Because you can't defend civil rights for one group and then be okay when civil rights are violated, because this is our mission, but a civil rights mission is across the board, and so that's really where it's been, and it's been confounding and distressing.
And so yeah, if I could layer on, I think this actually connects also to a lot of the point you were making about the way in which, like, certain plaintiffs who are presenting, though I will say that there was, I don't know if it was a legal complaint or I don't know precisely what it was, but at Davidson, you had a right-wing student group that just made a claim of anti-Semitism on behalf of Jews based on something about criticism of Israel. But there have been a lot of cases in which you've had groups of students or faculty who are raising hostile environment type claims predicated on language that has like a particular impact on them, which really is, borrowing from a lot of work and sort of theoretical sort of scaffolding that have been done by folks to try to find ways to like render legally cognizable harm that occurs through speech, for example. But just like with respect to power. So I think there's lots of ways in which we can empirically document the sort of both the asymmetry of impact and how that sort of is connected with power. So one is, I don't know if folks remember, and I think the spring of 2024 when Columbia sent, armed forces against their students, one of the claims was that it was necessary because there was a Title VI violation. Because the encampments constituted a hostile environment, and in order for Columbia to comply with their obligation under Title VI, they had to respond in the way they did. I have not yet asked an RA to help me do this search. I cannot remember any time in which a university has gone out there and said, we are violating Title VI. What I am familiar with is universities doing everything they can to say, we are not violating Title VI. Free speech. We are not violating Title VI. And so that is just this incredible moment of a university that is doing the sort of thing that I have long said universities should actually do. They should take seriously that many of the ways in which sort of conduct and speech occurs on their campus, unless it is remedied in a particular way, actually constitutes an unremedied hostile environment. And then you also get what I think of as collusion at places like UCLA, settling lawsuits that I think are sort of facially I can't think of the word because it's too late in the day.
Baloney?
That fail to offer sort of a clear factual predicate for the legal claim that there's some violation that has happened here, and not just settle, but then send millions of dollars to the organizations that are actually trying to prevent UCLA students and faculty from actually having the conversations they need to have. And you actually can't understand that unless we sort of peel it back and ask, well, who runs the institution? Like, who is it? Who are the regents? Who are the chancellors? Where are their political allegiances? Why is it that they are actually sort of, and then it's like, okay, well, do we actually have a real defendant here? And why you have cases in which you have sort of students that are trying to intervene, as happened in affirmative action litigation, so that there's a real defendant who's going to contest the claim that there is some legal violation. So that's sort of Exhibit A. Exhibit B, Harvard did a report on anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim racism. All the subjective reports suggested that Arab and Muslim Palestinian students had it worse than Jewish students. I'm not going to say that we should, that subjective reports mean everything, but that's what the subjective report said. And all the remedies were focused on anti-Semitism and certain Jewish students, not all Jewish students. One sort of little sort of thing that I'll just add here is I think that I would resist the framing of the sort of Palestinian Muslim students, Arab students on the one hand, Jewish students on the other, because you also have the Jewish students engage in advocacy on part of Palestine solidarity stuff, and they are either sort of rendered illegitimate Jews, not authentic Jews, or otherwise engaged in anti-Semitism, regardless of whether or not an encampment is full of Jewish ritual and mini sort of anti-Semitism trainings. And so there's a way in which it's not just the identity of the individual, but the project the individual is sort of engaged in that sort of determines sort of where they are. And then just to tell a personal story, so Concerned Jewish Faculty, this group that I'm a part of in the Boston area, we gave testimony, me and 3 colleagues, before Massachusetts Special Commission on Combating Anti-Semitism, which is a project of the ADL, which one of Massachusetts Democratic state senators who, proposed the amendment to the budget that got this thing going, proudly asserted on a webinar recently. Jonathan Greenblatt said it'd be a great idea. And in that testimony, which I just tried to point out how what this commission was doing in many ways echoed what the Heritage Foundation was doing. And I had a colleague, a scholar of anti-Semitism there, a scholar on K-12 pedagogy, and a political scientist sitting next to me who was trying to distinguish between problem and crisis, and how certain communities right now are facing crises. Anti-Semitism is a problem. He was trying to distinguish. And what were we told by the Democratic state rep in that hearing? We were told that we were gaslighting Jewish families. And so I'm not sure what that's responding to, but I think it is this dynamic where you have this a Democratic appointed commission, but it's the folks on it include Representative AJC, ADL, other groups, and part of what our intervention is attempting to do is to simply observe that the way in which the commission is running is both erasing the full spectrum of Jewish perspectives, sort of, and identity and orientation to these questions, and that by doing that, it's actually reproducing a very harmful sort of politics that we see coming out of the Heritage Foundation that does not make anyone safer. And yeah, sorry, yeah.
So you talked about the contemporary Jewish establishment, and in my estimation, I would be surprised to get pushback on it. It is at this moment, it is in complete disarray, right? It is in a way that is unprecedented in my lifetime. It is falling to pieces.
Or my longer lifetime.
It is falling to pieces, and in falling to pieces in part for some of the reasons that you articulate. That you contrast what the ADL was doing with the Muslim ban in 2016, and then by 2024 they can't figure out whether a Nazi salute at Inauguration Day is a problem, right? I mean, it's a complete collapse, and a complete is lost a ton of credence, both amongst kind of liberals writ large, right? Not just sort of leftists who had this already had suspicions or already had critiques, but sort of their liberal base that they had for a long time, and amongst these liberal Jews. I've long kind of analogized the ADL in the Jewish space to Hobbes' Leviathan, right? And that it's this overawing sovereign that you sort of even if it's horrible, you kind of have to be allegiant to it because the anarchic alternative is so dangerous. I don't know if I want to go about that weighing, but right now we're kind of seeing the anarchic alternative, and it's a situation, as we said, when I'm talking about how the discourse over anti-Semitism or discourse about Jews has completely spiraled out of the control of Jewish organizations. I think that's part of what we're seeing now. It's leading on the positive side to sort of this ferment of a more pluralized set of Jewish organizations that are trying to speak in a different register than what these legacy organizations like the AADL have been doing. And your group might be a part of that. The Nexus Project, which I'm affiliated with, is potentially could be a part of that. But none of these organizations have this sort of ability to kind of present, speak on behalf of the Jews, which in some ways is good because that, that papers over a lot of dissent in the community, but also has weaknesses in terms of Jews feeling very much in disarray and disempowered, right? And so when we conjoin that with what is the current situation of Jews, right? On the one hand, I'll stipulate. I don't know if I quite categorically agree, the way you put it, but I agree close enough so I'm willing to do it. That the Jews who look like me are white, right? That is a very important axis of marginalization. It is not but there are others, right? And I would say that the Jewish non-Jewish axis is an independent site of potential hierarchy that comes into play. Not to mention, right, those Jews that you said under any definition are non-Jewish. We talk about the Middle Eastern, North African Jews. It's a very large population here in California, a very large presence here at schools like UCLA or UC Berkeley, where I used to teach. And their outlook on these situations is, it's not identical, I think, to the sort of Ashkenazi Jewish one, but it's one that I think is kind of, it's not that far, it's not radically disjoined from it either. And one of the major points of conjunction is that they feel like they're being involuntarily conscripted into whiteness, right? And in a way that rejects their validity as authentically from Iraqi or Moroccan or what have you, and then they'll be their own cuisine gets presented as a form of theft, things of that nature, right? All of which is to say that there are cross-cutting patterns here. I suspect that you are, when you say let's do the empirical analysis of who's getting expelled from campus, I feel confident in your numbers. Overall hate crime statistics in the United States, Jews are the most common victims of hate crimes in the United States, and it's by something like for religious-based hate crimes, by something like a 6-to-1 margin, right? It's overwhelmingly there. We could poke at the data about underreporting and things of that nature. I don't think any of that's going to bridge a 6-to-1 margin gap, right? So there we do see, a systematic form of problems, we might say, that are afflicting Jews, right? And one poll that I saw when we
Can
talked
you
about
make
these.
this a wrap-up
This a
point,
wrap-
because
yeah.
we're keeping people
Yeah.
over, which I try not to do
Yeah.
in class, but
It was very interesting and very depressing. Everything that I do is interesting and depressing in equal measure, right? It was at the University of Washington, and they were asking Jewish and Israeli and Palestinian and Muslim and Arab students about kind of their, how their sense of safety on campus, their belonging, welcoming, things of that nature. But then also asked, like, how do you assess how other groups are? And what we saw was the Jewish and Israeli students said, basically, we are having a miserable experience. They're doing great. All the students love them. They've got all this support. They've got all this backing. They're doing fantastic. And the Muslim and Palestinian and Arab students said, we're not doing great at all. We're doing very badly. We're facing all this repression. Jewish and Israeli students, they're doing great, right? They have administrative backing. They say jump and people say how high. Everybody is miserable, right? Everybody thinks that it's only everybody else but me is getting getting these perquisites, and I think it is very valuable not to collapse there, say it's all the same, everybody's suffering. I think we don't want to go that route, but I think this highly perspective based we shouldn't be generalized. We need to look at the Jewish experience in its specificity and not just as a subspecies of being white. We need to look at Palestinian and Muslim and Arab experiences in their specificity, right? It's going to tell us interesting things, right? And it might tell us some surprising things, it might tell us some helpful things, it might tell us some challenging things. But there's no way that we're going to be able to move in a positive direction, move in a productive direction without that sort of tool, which I think is fundamentally what critical race theory has to offer.
including the freedom to be wrong. To be wrong about stuff. Thank you all very much.